All he heard was a woman crying, high off the ground with no way down. She was tied up in a cottonwood tree. Her wrists burned red from rope, and her dress was torn just enough to shame her in the open sun. Her legs were bound wrong, cruel wrong, and the summer wind kept lifting the fabric she tried to hide behind. When she saw him, her face flushed with panic and humiliation, and she shouted the only words she had left, "Don't look there." He didn't look the way they wanted him to. He looked long enough to cut her down and to see the trap. Ezekiel's heart froze beneath that tree, one hand still on the fence post, the other drifting toward his holster without thinking. He was 49, and he had lived long enough to know when trouble wasn't looking for help, but for witnesses. The Wyoming sun beat down hard, the kind of heat that made men irritable and horses stubborn, and he knew this land well enough to feel when it had turned hostile. The woman struggled again. The branch creaked, and the rope bit deeper into her skin. She turned her face away from him, teeth clenched, trying to protect what little dignity she had left. Zeke told himself to look away. He told himself this was none of his business because mining your own land kept you alive out here. But he didn't turn his head. He looked because a man can't untie a knot he refuses to see. Her voice came out between shallow breaths, trembling, and she said her name was Clara Delaney. She was 21, new to Wyoming, and every word cost her something. She hadn't fallen. She hadn't wandered into this. She hadn't been spared by accident. This was done to her on purpose. Zeke cut the rope slow, careful not to drop her, careful not to make her feel any smaller than she already did. When her boots hit the ground, her knees buckled, and she grabbed the front of his shirt just to stay upright. He didn't touch her more than he had to. He kept his eyes level, fixed on the horizon, because she had asked him not to look, and because some requests mattered more than others. He kept his gaze off her body because shame wasn't hers to carry. That was when he felt it, the weight of another set of eyes somewhere out beyond the tall grass. Zeke straightened, heart tightening, and scanned the land the way a man does when he knows he's already late. Nothing moved, but that didn't mean no one was there. Clara saw the change in his face. "They're close," she whispered. "They didn't leave me like that to die." Zeke understood then with a sick calm that surprised him. This wasn't random cruelty. This was bait. And the horrifying part wasn't what he saw, it was what he had to do next. Go to war with the men wearing the law. They left her high and exposed on purpose to break her and to see who was foolish enough to cut her down. He took her to his ranch without asking permission because asking would have wasted time they didn't have. The ride was quiet, broken only by the sound of leather and breath, and the way Clara kept her arms folded tight across herself. She didn't cry anymore. That worried him more than the crying had. At the ranch, Zeke gave her water, a clean shirt, and space. He stood outside while she changed, staring at the barn wall like it held answers. When she stepped out, she looked older somehow, like the day had taken something from her and replaced it with resolve. That was when Silas Crow rode in. Silas lived a mile west, close enough to wave at, far enough to never truly know. He smiled too easily, asked too many questions, and let his eyes linger just a second too long on Clara. Zeke felt something cold settle in his chest. Silas said he'd heard shouting earlier. Silas said folks should look out for one another. Silas said he could fetch the sheriff if needed. Zeke thanked him and watched him ride away, counting the seconds until the dust settled. Clara waited until Silas was gone before she spoke again. "He's the reason," she said. "He didn't do it himself, but he knows who did." That night, Zeke didn't sleep. He sat at the table, rifle across his knees, replaying the moment beneath that tree. He knew the law would ask questions he couldn't answer cleanly. He knew the town would whisper before it listened, and he knew that by cutting that rope, he had stepped into something that wouldn't let him walk back out. The wind rattled the windows just before dawn. Zeke stood and checked the yard, hand tied on his rifle. Nothing was there, but he knew better now than to trust empty land. So, here's the question that hangs over everything that follows. When a man sees something he was never meant to witness, does doing the right thing make him a hero, or does it just make him the next target? The sun hadn't even cracked the horizon when Zeke walked the perimeter of his property. His boots pressed into the frozen earth, the cold creeping through the worn leather, biting at his toes and heels. Clara had stayed inside, pulling the blanket tight over her shoulder, the only warmth she'd allowed herself since the night before. Zeke could hear her breathing in the small cabin, slow and deliberate, but it didn't calm him. There were things out there that couldn't be tamed, and one glance at that tree had shown him just how cruel men could be. He knew they were watching still. Whoever had left Clara bound wasn't finished, and every second he waited made the trap bigger. He could feel the eyes in the grass, in the branches, even in the sky, as if the crows had taken sides. He didn't like crows. They were too smart, too eager to notice when a man hesitated. Zeke's hands hovered over his rifle more than once, fingers brushing the worn wood, testing the weight, counting the rounds, feeling the cold steel at his side. He had fought men before, in back alleys, in saloons, on open land where the horizon was the only witness. But this was different. This was a woman, someone who hadn't asked for any of it, and that changed everything. Clara came to the door, her hair loose, tangled from sleep, eyes sharper than he remembered. "They'll be back," she said, voice low, almost a hiss. He nodded. "I know." He wanted to say more, something to reassure her, but words felt cheap out here. Nothing cheap survived long in Wyoming. He turned his head, scanning the distant hills, the ridges that hid the snakes and wolves alike. He had to plan, to think 3 moves ahead, like a chess game where every piece could die. By midday, the wind had shifted, carrying dust and a faint scent of smoke from the south. Zeke made Clara sit and eat, though she barely touched the bread and jerky he offered. She stared out the window, watching the horizon like it held the answer, like it could warn her when the shadow came. He didn't interrupt. Silence out here was often louder than words, and he trusted it more than a man's promise. When she finally spoke, it wasn't a question or a plea. It was information. "It's the man from the saloon, the one with the black hat and the scar. He's the reason I was left there. He's behind it all." Zeke's stomach sank. He had suspected someone, a few men, nameless shadows. But to hear it named gave the moment weight, a weight that pressed down on his chest. The scarred men had influence, people who moved like ghosts, who could disappear before your eyes and leave chaos in their wake. Zeke didn't flinch. He had faced ghosts before. What scared him was that Clara had looked to him, eyes steady, like she knew he would act. And act he would. Afternoon came, hot and relentless. Zeke rode out to the north pasture, rifle across the saddle, checking the fences, listening for signs. Horses stirred uneasily, their tails flicking, ears pricked, sensing danger. He moved slow, methodical, every movement deliberate. A branch cracked behind him, and he spun, rifle up, but it was just a rabbit. Still, it made him think, made him feel the trap tightening. He had to be ready, or Clara would pay the price. Evening fell, painting the sky in streaks of red and orange. Zeke returned to the cabin, boots dusted with dirt, fingers raw from the cold. Clara had lit a fire, the smoke curling through the room, filling the air with pine and sage. He watched her, quiet, as she worked to cook something small, nothing fancy. She moved with purpose, not the careless steps of someone broken. That worried him more than her fear. People who hide resolve are often the most dangerous, and he needed to remember that. Night settled heavy and thick. They sat at the table, silent, shadows flickering across the walls. Zeke finally broke it. "They'll come again," he said, voice rough, low. Clara nodded. "Next time, they won't leave me alive if you're not here." He leaned back, hand brushing the rifle, mind ticking. The trap was bigger now, bait laid out, and he had to decide if he would step forward alone or take the fight to them. There were no easy choices, not anymore. By midnight, Zeke had made his plan. He'd wait until the scarred man showed himself, draw him out, and end it quick. But the thought of Clara, alone for even a second, gnawed at him. He'd learned long ago that protecting someone out here meant more than bullets and fences. It meant watching, listening, and never letting your guard down. He felt the weight of that night pressing down, knowing that when dawn broke, nothing would ever be the same. The wind rattled the shutters again, whispering secrets he didn't want to hear. He checked the rifle, loaded, ready. Clara slept fitfully, hands gripping the blanket. And Zeke realized that by cutting that rope, by stepping into her nightmare, he'd stepped into something far bigger than either of them could imagine. And out here, in the wide open West, once you're in, there's no stepping out clean. The next morning broke slow and uneasy, the sky a pale gray that made the hills look colder than they were. Zeke rode out again, this time circling the property, rifle loose across the saddle, eye sharp. He could feel the tension humming through the air, like a wire stretched too tight. Even the horses were jittery, stamping and snorting, tails twitching like they knew the trouble was close. Zeke hated being surprised, hated the idea that some shadowy hand might strike before he could act. But that was life out here. Every step could be the one that decided if you lived or didn't. Clara had woken early, sat by the window with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. She hadn't slept well. He didn't ask why. Sleep and conversation didn't mix well when the kind of men they were up against were loose and hungry. Zeke knew that silence could be a shield, and he respected it. He waited until she finished her coffee, watching the light in her eyes sharpen, become focused. She had a fire in her, a stubborn streak that refused to bow. That fire could get a man killed or save his life. By mid-morning, Zeke had scoped the northern ridge, noticed fresh tracks leading down into the valley. Big boots, heavy tread, likely two men. He dismounted, rifle at the ready, and crept along the slope, boots sinking slightly in the dirt, careful to step where no twig could betray him. The valley below stretched wide, dotted with scrub and rocks. He could see a flicker of movement, a shadow, moving behind a boulder, just enough for him to guess there were eyes on him. Back at the cabin, Clara was restless. She paced the floor, hands brushing over the table, over the firewood stacked neatly in the corner. She paused at the window, squinting toward the ridge where Zeke had gone. When she spoke, it wasn't a question. "He's here," she said quietly. Zeke felt a chill. He had hoped for more time, more distance, but this was the nature of the fight. They had come for her before, and they would come again, until she was nothing more than a pawn or worse, a story told around some drunken saloon fire. Zeke's mind worked fast. He thought of every escape, every trap he could set, every misdirection. He knew the scarred man had cunning, the kind that made ordinary precautions laughable. But Zeke had grit, and more importantly, he had no intention of letting Clara become a casualty. He moved like a shadow through the trees, hiding in plain sight, calculating every rock, every hollow, every whisper of one became a signal, a guide. The valley yawned wide beneath him, and then he saw them, two men, rough and impatient, rifles slung over shoulders. The scarred man was unmistakable, the black hat shadowing half his face, a crooked smirk showing when he thought no one was looking. Zeke gritted his teeth. The bastard had no idea he was being watched, had no clue the hunter had become the hunted. Zeke counted his shots, rehearsed his stance, every sense tuned to the moment he could strike without giving a warning. Hours passed in tension, the kind that made a man's chest tight, and his thoughts sharp. Clara waited in the cabin, restless but silent, listening to every bird, every rustle of brush. She had learned to read the land like a man, had learned the subtle language of danger, and when she peeked out the window and saw the scarred man moving with impatience, muttering to his companion, she clenched her fists. Fear had no place in her expression. There was only resolve, only that stubborn spark that Zeke had noticed since the first day. Night fell again, and with it, the temperature dropped. Zeke made his move, creeping from cover to cover, rifle ready. He could hear the men laughing, overconfident, thinking the open valley gave them power. But Zeke had patience, and patience was a weapon few men understood. When the first shot rang out, sharp and final, it changed everything. The second man dove for cover, screaming, the echo bouncing off the canyon walls. Zeke moved again, silent, methodical, the world narrowing to the rhythm of his heartbeat and the recoil of the rifle. Back at the cabin, Clara flinched at the noise, but she didn't run. She had learned that running was for the unprepared. She grabbed the lantern, peered out the window, and saw movement, figures scrambling, confusion spreading. Zeke's plan had worked, for now. But she knew the night was far from over. Whoever survived would regroup, and the scarred man's influence ran deep. She swallowed the fear, feeling it hard in her chest, and steeled herself. By midnight the ridge was quiet again. Zeke returned to the cabin, boots muddy, hands stiff, eyes sharp. Clara was waiting, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself a small, exhausted smile. He didn't speak. Words were too small for what had just happened. The firelight danced on their faces, casting long shadows, and for a moment, they were just two people surviving another night in the West. But the shadow of the scarred man lingered, a reminder that the fight wasn't over, that dawn would bring new trials, new dangers, and the kind of reckoning that only the wilderness could deliver.